From a U.S. perspective, the outlook for less dependence, or energy independence, depending on how you want to look at it, the outlook for less dependence hasn't been brighter for many decades. And so what a great subject to talk about tonight, and one which this panel truly is uniquely qualified to discuss. I just wish we had a couple of hours to do it. Jan and David have just published the second edition of their book, Energy and Security. And this one has a subtitle, this time around it has a subtitle, Strategies for a World in Transition. In addition, Amy is a major contributing author to the book and has written and been widely quoted on matters, all kinds of energy matters, including most recently relating to OPEC. You probably have some questions on that. And so fasten your seatbelts, you're in for a treat here, I think, tonight. So until recently, Russia led the world in the production of natural gas. And on oil, it's between Saudi Arabia and Russia, depending on your definition. There's all kinds of definitional issues. However, big changes are afoot, and within the last couple of years, the United States has passed Russia on natural gas production. And if we haven't already, and some say we have, we will shortly pass both Russia and Saudi Arabia in the production of total liquids, total oil, if you include natural gas liquids, that's the propane and butane and things that come out of natural gas, and biofuels, which of course the United States has got quite a lot. In fact, we're now preparing as a country to export significant volumes of natural gas in the form of LNG, and we're currently exporting large volumes of gasoline, diesel, and other refined products. And we'll shortly be debating the pros and cons, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of both, pros and cons of exporting crude oil. For us in the oil and gas business and for the U.S. economy, this is an enormous and largely unexpected turn of events with huge implications both domestic and globally. So in addressing the energy independence issue, our guests will be talking about these implications, global implications and domestic implications. And so with no further ado, I'm going to turn to each of them to make a few framing remarks, and then I'll come back and maybe I'll have a couple of questions of my own, and hopefully the audience will have some questions. So, Jan.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. That's a great introduction. And I think of all the leadership in the energy area at Chevron and Deloitte and World Affairs Council and et cetera, et cetera. And so I look forward very much to this. That's right. I was paid a little bit to say that. So why don't I just say something about the main themes in our book, which really do address the question of the progression from dependence to relative independence, or as I like to say, self-sufficiency. And then my co-editor and friend, David Goldwyn, will address, I think, the sort of the prescriptions and what actually our strategy calls for. And Amy will be her controversial self, I hope, and tell us why OPEC will or will not last for 50 years and what the energy landscape looks like. So just to say a few words to get the conversation rolling, I would make four main points about our book. The first is that the energy world is just about 180 degrees changed from the time that we wrote the first edition of in 2005. Of course, we knew that at the time, and that's why we have a second edition. We think it's a good idea, and maybe we'll have a third edition when we prove wrong about what we say today. Then we thought we were so smart and that the name of the game was to manage growing energy dependence. And now, of course, it's the opposite, as Peter said, and maybe it's even energy independence in the minds of some people, not mine, but some people who look at this. Second, there's a brilliant chapter in our book written by two fine academics at MIT, Ernie Moniz and Melanie Kenderdine. Inside joke, Mr. Moniz is now Secretary of Energy, but he was at the time MIT professor. And that is the big reason for the change, I think, is technology. And Moniz and Kenderdine outline in great detail the impact of technology on the business. People think often of energy as being separate from technology, and nothing could be further from the truth. They're very, very closely connected. And then when you think about ultra-deep water drilling, all the way to shale oil and gas production, we certainly can expect North America, as Peter was saying, to be equal in energy power to Russia and Saudi Arabia within a very few years. Some people say, well, maybe 10 years, but others say very few years. The third point is that even if North American energy independence were to become achievable someday, I think it's fair to say that we all think it would be a terrible mistake to pursue such a strategy. We have inherently in our increased energy capacity and negotiating power that can be used, hopefully in concert with our friends and partners, to do a number of things. And this is what we argue in the book: to get a level playing field in energy trade, to gain increased access for energy investment, to pursue regional goals from true European energy security to a new energy and environment compact for the Arctic, and to guarantee oil and gas supplies to good allies like Japan when we ask them to take risks as we have with sanctions against Iran. This is just to give you a flavor of the overall themes, and we'll give you the detail in a moment. But let me get to the fourth and final point about the book. In our first edition, we called for an integrated energy and foreign policy strategy for the United States. We thought it was just a mess. There wasn't the kind of coordination between the two in the U.S. government. I'm always reminded that the last thing that would occur to somebody sitting around in the State Department would be to call over to the Treasury, for example, about energy. Inconceivable, and yet energy and economics are incredibly closely tied. And I would say that since then there has been some good progress. There's a new Energy Resources Bureau at State, and David has a lot to do with the establishment of that. And there's a ramped-up international policy function underway right now, I would argue, at DOE with Secretary Moniz there, who cares about that. And no doubt there's plenty of room for progress in the U.S. government. I think it's kind of obvious when you read the newspapers. But I think that some progress has been made in the energy area. So when you get to the second edition of our book, we recognize with our authors that it's not just about getting our own act together, which is really important, at the state and the federal levels between business and government and amongst different regions in the country, because there are different regional interests at play. What we recognize is that even if we do get our act together somewhat here in the U.S., we need to do much more to achieve true energy security, and that's because it's so intertwined with economic and climate and global security issues. So the idea of a U.S. sort of sitting happily by itself without being connected to the bad world out there is, we think, just not very credible, shall I say, to be polite. So we suggest a different approach, which we are calling GESS, and I will tell you what GESS is, which is a global energy security system that looks for win-win rather than zero-sum solutions. And so the hallmark of GESS would be energy interdependence, not isolation or energy trade wars. David will get into this in more detail, but overall we think this should mean free energy trade, two-way investment, serious greenhouse gas reduction, and not only that, we think GESS should mean enhanced engagement with consumers and producers to forecast supply and demand and respond to supply disruptions precisely, quickly, and effectively. So steps like these, we think, are the building blocks for energy interdependence, leading to technology cooperation, greater energy access, a global reserve network, and safe, fuel-powered economic growth. We realize this depends on sustained U.S. technology leadership and increased U.S. energy leverage, which are within our grasp. But it also depends on increased bilateral and multilateral cooperation, and we think we can achieve that too, despite disturbing signs of lack thereof in many parts of the world. So as the energy landscape changes fundamentally, we think that the country's energy security requirements change with it, and that it has to be tied into the world market and its trends. Bilateral and regional building blocks abound for such strategies. After decades of impasse, China and the U.S. are stepping up cooperation against greenhouse gases. The U.S., EU, and Russia are cooperating in energy efficiency. Saudi Arabia is investing in solar energy and cutting back consumption. Regionally, the Arctic Council is preparing to promote energy development and protect the sensitive polar environment. And globally, all countries can and must combat energy poverty and avert the shortages and outages that further destabilize countries like Pakistan and Yemen. So to conclude, we think GESS can translate into a win-win agenda well suited to the challenges of the 21st century, as opposed to the zero-sum agenda of oil embargoes and producer-consumer confrontation. We think that countries should turn away from the siren calls of protectionism and seize the opportunity to advance globally to a new and cooperative energy security system, which really should be part of a broader outlook on international economic and trade and investment cooperation. So I've said enough, and I think at this point I will turn over to my great friend, co-editor, David Goldwyn, to take it from there.
Great. Thank you, Jan, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for hosting us. The very first line of the book is that the American energy landscape has changed, but public perceptions and government policy have not caught up with it. And we, and I would say of the 26 contributors we have, a good dozen of them all believe that this increase in production of oil and gas and the technology which made it possible really provide us with a pivotal moment in the world balance of power. We believe that this change has the ability to enhance American national power, to enable us to secure short and medium-term greenhouse gas reductions, not only here, but worldwide, to democratize energy access around the world, especially in places that are dependent on a single country for their resource, and then, as Jan has explained through the GUESS system, to use energy as a really effective tool of national power. But it's only an opportunity. And it's not clear whether or not we'll seize it, because we don't always seize as a government the opportunities that come our way. But I spent enough time in government to say you can't really present a problem without coming up with some prescriptions. So of the many prescriptions we have, I want to offer 10, which are really, I think, our top 10 list of ways that we can take advantage of this opportunity. The first, I think, is to embrace the idea that this oil and gas production is indeed a good thing and something that we should support. And my colleagues in the Obama administration had a good deal of ambivalence about this, I think, the first 2 years of the administration before they saw the economic boon. So for government, that means creating a framework where people can do production. But for industry, it means you can't just talk about best practices. You actually have to implement them. You have to accept that people are uncomfortable and nervous about the production and walk the walk. And for the big international companies like Chevron and Exxon that have a lot of moral hazard, they're probably going to do that because they have reputational risk. But half the U.S. unconventional production comes from independent companies. So it's incumbent on the states to do the right thing and for industry, especially the leaders, to embrace that regulation so it happens. And Bill Riley, former EPA administrator, the co-chairman of the Deepwater Horizon Commission, has a chapter in the book on embracing a culture of safety. So I think that's number one. It's a fantastic thing, but we have to industry and government have to embrace it. The second is we need to take this opportunity to break down monopolies in oil and gas production. And we really do that through exports. If you look at what has happened to the price of gas for, here in the U.S. we pay $4 per MMBTU for gas, but they pay $11 in Europe, $18 in Asia. So they're paying monopoly rents over there, and that's because, particularly in Europe, they're dependent largely on Russia for their supply. So when the U.S. didn't need all of this gas because of our production, Russia had to renegotiate its contracts. The price of gas dropped. That's an economic boon for Europe. That is a more competitive market. If we embrace exports of natural gas, not to be the world's largest supplier, but just to introduce that competition into the market, we will bring down gas prices. That means you can substitute gas for coal in places where gas is still really expensive and coal is very cheap, the way we've done it here, and you can create a more competitive market for countries in Central and Eastern Europe which are dependent on that gas. And if you look at the appeal of U.S. trade agreements, Trans-Pacific Partnership, TTIP, the one with Europe, why is Japan in TPP? Because of the prospect of getting natural gas exports. So it's an enormously powerful tool. The third is infrastructure. We need to create the infrastructure to move this oil and gas from the areas of production where it is to the demand centers. And that, for oil and gas, that's pipelines that are going to go from west to east or from north to south. It's going to be LNG infrastructure to be able to move the gas to export. It's going to be gathering lines for places where oil is produced in the Bakken and it's being flared. So you need to gather that gas, you need to move it to a pipeline, and you have to monetize it. And exports are a way to monetize it. It also means on the electricity grid, we have to harden the grid against cyber attacks, but also extreme weather events. So this is sort of a new area of infrastructure, but it falls on government to create permitting processes to enable that to move swiftly and to happen the way it needs to. A fourth area is to invest now in a low-carbon economy. there's no question that the substitution of gas for coal has led to significant greenhouse gas reductions in this economy. And if you look at what it would take to get to a low-carbon economy, we are probably 10 years away from having commercial-scale carbon sequestration and utility-scale storage. And that's really what you need to be able to make renewable energy, baseload energy, not only here, but in countries around the world. But for the next 10 years, gas for coal is the largest single way that you can reduce greenhouse gas emissions everywhere in the world. But it doesn't mean that we should just take gas as a destination rather than what will probably be a really long bridge. We need to take this time to continue the investment in those technologies, both battery technology, carbon sequestration, utility scale storage, and to use this time and that benefit to create the technologies that we will need 10 years out, 15 years out to get to a zero carbon economy. And Dr. Moniz and Melanie Kenderdine have a very long chapter about the state of the current technologies and what it takes to get from here to there. But there's no question that we're still in the research, development, and deployment phase. And that leads me to the next recommendation, which is fostering a culture of innovation. Innovation is really what's going to get us to a low-carbon economy. And the Department of Energy has started ARPA-E and technology innovation hubs, which have really created great laboratories for working with the private sector for innovation. But we really need to do more. And Dr. Moniz, in his book, talked about having a quadrennial energy review, sort of refocusing and prioritizing the Department of Energy and federal research dollars in a focused way to be able to get us to a low-carbon economy. And good news, he's got the plan. It came from the President's Council on Science and Technology, and now he's in charge of implementing it. But innovation will really be the game changer for us. Overseas, what we need to do is to spread the wealth. And this is propagating this tight oil and gas technology to countries around the world. And some of that is by having government relations that have them create an environment where they protect intellectual property. Some of it is by having government-to-government conversations about how to produce tight gas safely and efficiently. And when I was in the government, we had a global shale gas initiative, which was taking our EPA and state regulators and talking to host country regulators to say, this is what you need to know to do this safely. These are the laws you need to have in place, and industry will do the rest. But if you think of the changes that can happen for Eastern Europe, if they can grow some of their own gas, what it would mean for China if it can grow some of its own gas and not be dependent on countries that are concerned for imports. It could really be phenomenal, both from a geopolitical point of view and from a climate point of view. So I think we have an ability to do that, and we should. The seventh recommendation is to make a serious effort to address energy poverty. And if you look at trends, Richard Newell's first chapter talks about huge growth in population in South Asia, and also the Middle East, and to some extent and in Africa. So you're having a huge population growth, growing urbanization, increases in energy demand. But where are these people going to get baseload energy? And what happens to these countries if they don't get baseload energy? So you have a security issue that you address through development, but you don't address development without electricity. And you don't get electricity unless you have a way to subsidize the poor, but not everybody, and have a way for people to sell electricity and make money off of it so they can use a feedstock other than biomass and coal. So that's really a government-to-government initiative. It's a diplomatic initiative to get governments to create a framework to address energy poverty, but it's also a conversation about governance and transparency and the things that you have to address in order for people to want to invest in another country. Our eighth recommendation is really to get greater harmony from interdependence. And if you just look at right now, opportunities we have. China dependent on the Middle East for its energy, China dependent on the U.S. for security of supply lanes. If the U.S. has a conflict with Iran, the price of oil goes up, China pays that price more dearly even than we do because they subsidize both products and the imports of oil and the other effects. So we have an ability to get diplomatic leverage with China on things that we want to do in the Middle East because the Chinese need us also. That's interdependence. Saudi Arabia, as Jan talked about, needing solar energy and a stable market. So we have things that they need, so we can have a better conversation with them on things that are important to them. And what does the pivot to Asia mean, other than a couple of military troops in Australia and other places? What does it mean for China or for Korea or for Japan for us to be able to address their energy needs? If you look what's going on with Iran right now, where would we be if our production had not put enough downward pressure on oil prices that the Iranians, that taking 2 million barrels a day of Iranian supply off the market didn't disrupt global oil markets? It was our production and Saudi Arabia and a little bit of Iraqi production that replaced that. We wouldn't have gotten the Chinese and the Indians and the Koreans to reject imports of Iranian oil if they were going to pay prices that were going to damage their economies. So it's that kind of interdependence, building coalitions, which I think links what we're able to do and what countries are able to do overseas. So there are more of those opportunities. Two more recommendations we have. One is to modernize international energy institutions. The IEA was created in 1973. It had 90% of the world's consumers of energy. Not anymore. China's not in there, India's not in there, so we need to bring them into a system, and we need to deal with emergency response. We built the SPR, which is 700 million barrels of oil, thinking that if oil was disrupted, we would be able to supply ourselves with all the oil we needed. Well, we're importing less. We're down to we're going to go down to 4 million barrels a day, so we'll be able to put that oil on the market. But we'll be helping the Chinese when we do that. We'll be helping the Indians when we do that. So we've got some coin to talk to them about how they're going to contribute to emergency response as well. The last recommendation we have, number 10, is to organize for change. Our government has 13 agencies which have something to do with energy and nobody in charge. There's no one in the White House. There is someone at the Domestic Policy Council who does domestic, the National Security Council that does international, and the National Economic Council that cares about oil prices when they go over $105 Brent. So, but there's no one who's putting these pieces together. And while as Jan said, the Energy Department and the State Department have really ramped up their game, leadership in the United States comes from the White House. So the White House needs to have somebody in charge of both domestic and international so we can put these pieces together and take advantage of this opportunity. So we have these powerful tools. I think we really have the technology to do them. The element that we're really missing at this point is the leadership to use them. And it's a great opportunity. And so we hope with some of these recommendations our government will take advantage of them.
Okay, so David answered all the questions. Amy, what are you going to talk about?
So I'm going to talk about the United States and our ability to lead internationally on the subject of energy and climate. We have a unique opportunity today, partly here I'm talking from the heart of Silicon Valley, partly because of the technologies and innovations coming out of Silicon Valley, and we have competing innovations coming from my former state of Texas. And we have a very partisan dialogue about those two things. And the question is, here we are at the 40th anniversary of the 1973 oil embargo. And not to put a differential in our ages, Peter, but my recollection of 1973 is having to get up early for school at 5 a.m. so that I could sit in the car with my father, who drove me to school, and wait in line on the odd days of our license plate for gasoline. And I tell people that as an adult now, I realize that event made a big impact on me. Didn't seem like it at the time, but I've spent the last 30 years of my life thinking about what we should do so that would never happen again. That Americans would not get up in the morning and because of the political will of a country far away, we would not be able to go to work, we would not be able to heat our homes, we would not be able to have affordable energy. What did we need to do as a country to make sure that never happened again? And we are really close to being able to achieve that now. And the question really is, are we going to let partisanship divide us? Right? What technologies are available today? What is the role of oil and gas in our future? How do we get to the clean tech vision that state of California and others would like to move us to? And what's the roadmap for doing that? And one of the mistakes I think that was made in the environmental community is there was an assumption that if we somehow just burdened ourselves with very high oil prices, that would enable solar and all these other innovation technologies that are expensive, and it would just magically happen. Silver bullet. We'd have this high oil price of $100 a barrel, and then everything else would just work itself out. We'd have solar panels on our homes, we'd plug in our electric car, and off we'd go, problem solved. And the problem is that when you have $100 oil, people who produce oil have the incentive to innovate too. And no matter how much money the U.S. government is investing in new technologies, other companies that work in oil and gas, they're investing in innovation too. And so now we've developed a way to produce oil and gas from what I call the source rock. So years ago, we had geologists. They would have to find a trap under the ground, some tiny little pond of oil that they would find thousands of feet under the ground or under the ocean, and they would have to develop all this technology to find this little pond of oil that was under layers and layers of rock. And it had migrated from what they called source rock. So it was trapped in these tiny, 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 tiny holes in rock, and over millions of years it would pour out into this little pond, and we would have to find the pond. It's like a needle in a haystack. And that is why, we were all paying $100 of oil, because it's hard to do. And then in the places where we knew it had poured into a pond, like Saudi Arabia or Russia, they had an economic interest in making sure that we couldn't just find every place there was oil and produce it and, voila, have the low price. So they did what they could to put barriers to investment pace so that they would get a higher rent from their oil. But now, the United States industry has figured out a way to actually produce oil and gas from the source rock. And there is source rock everywhere. And part of what's making a controversy in the United States is this source rock is in states that aren't used to having oil and gas production. It's in Pennsylvania. It's in Florida. It's here in California, right? Though we were used to oil production around Bakersfield, but it's in states, Ohio, states that we don't think of as oil-producing states, and New York. And so the question is not only can we do this safely, and what would the regulations that would be required to do this safely, but if I'm living in bucolic, upstate New York, do I even want industrialization near my community? And so we're having difficulty even wrapping our brains around two things. Number one, this high price of oil is bringing more oil. And we thought this high price of oil was going to bring clean tech. So what do we do as citizens if we want clean tech? What do we have to do? Because just saying that we're willing to pay more money is not going to be enough, because now we're going to have an endless supply, well, not 100% endless, but a very plentiful supply of oil and gas, and we could have a very plentiful supply of oil and gas right here in the United States with all kinds of geopolitical benefits for our country. And the question is, what are our values? Are we committed to clean energy? What are we willing to do about clean energy? If the price of gasoline were to go down because we have so much oil and gas that maybe over time, if things settle down in the Middle East, we could have low oil and gas prices. Are we still committed to shift to electricity and other cleaner fuels? What do we want to do as a society? And it's such a transformational period. And that transformation is not only because we're at the pivot of having all these different technologies we could choose from, and then we could send our president, our secretary of state, and our secretary of energy out to China and other places and say, hey, look, do what we're doing. But we have cultural leadership. And the question really is, and I like to say this because I see the faces here in this audience, if I'm 22 or 25 or 18 years old today, what future do I want? How do I want that energy, my need for energy to be expressed? What form of energy am I willing and wanting to use? And how do I raise my voice to get the energy future that I want? And I see great promise in this millennial generation to look at that issue more carefully. What's my lifestyle? Am I going to live in urban density and I'm not going to have a car? Am I going to have a car if I have a car? Am I concerned about its fuel efficiency or the type of fuel it uses? These are all questions that I think for the first time in our history, young people are not just accepting the energy infrastructure and the energy system that we've created, but they're interested in social change. And the United States is in a very unique position today, not only with its ability, I think, over time to export oil and gas, but also in its ability to export its social lifestyle. So if young people in this country, vote for new technologies and new ways of lifestyle that use less energy and are less polluting, then other countries will follow us, the young people in other countries, the same way they're photographing themselves with their smartphones and emailing it to their friends just as we are. we can do the same thing in energy from this younger generation. How we use energy is going to be the way that young people in the Middle East and young people in China and young people in Latin America are also going to seek to use energy. And that really is our responsibility to lead.
Wow. Okay. So there's about 1,000 different subjects here to talk about, but I just want to maybe, I don't know whether to put a stake in this energy independence notion or not, but we've talked a lot about energy independence. It's the title of the talk, and you've heard lots of comments about are we independent, are we not? But a lot of people think, well, first of all, I think energy independence really deals with oil.
Yep.
I mean, because we basically produce all our natural gas, and we usually we get some from Canada, but we basically over the years produced our natural gas. We produce our nuclear fuel. We produce our biofuels. We produce our coal. We produce our own renewables to the extent we have them. So energy independence, really, the issue has been about oil. But in fact, oil has been about 35% of our energy in the United States. And half of that, I mean, I'm using rough number, it was 60%, now it's 40%, but let's say half of it's imported. So that's 17%. So we've actually been about 83% energy independent. If you think about just we produce our own. But why has everybody been worried about it? Been worried about this oil imports. So now that we're going to be able to, maybe North America is going to be able to produce all its own oil, do we not have to worry about the Middle East anymore? Do we not have to worry about prices going up and down with events in the world? Do we not have to worry about disruptions, supply disruptions? I mean, I think that's what a lot of people think when we talk about energy independence. Can we stop providing security in the Middle East? All of those kinds of things. I mean, David, why don't you take a crack at just what is energy independence or what is it not? Yeah.
No, I think what you're talking about really is price. And the problem since 1973, and it continues today, is that oil is a globally traded commodity, the largest globally traded commodity, and a price shock anywhere affects prices everywhere. So we are not immune, even if we imported no oil whatsoever. We're not immune from price shocks. And because Saudi Arabia is still probably, one of the top three, it is one of the top three suppliers, but probably the most critical oil supplier in the world, a disruption in the Persian Gulf, which could disrupt 5-7 million barrels a day of oil, and LNG from Qatar as well, could provide a shock to the global economy, damage the U.S. economy, and make our allies quite vulnerable. So we can't yet be immune from the Middle East because it's so important to global oil supply, and because so many of our friends and allies are dependent on Middle East supply as well. So I think we're not immune, and I think that's why you're seeing our geostrategic interests remain, keeping those supply lanes open and keeping countries from being transgressed.
But even if prices go up, if there's a shortage if prices go up, our gasoline prices go up, but at least the money stays in America. I mean, producers are in America, so you have obviously the money goes to a different set of people.
Right, the money has changed. I mean,
it's not going in boatloads to
we have
the Middle East.
Strategic reserves to replace it. And we are surviving now without Iranian or Libyan oil on the market, which is pretty remarkable given what's happened.
Well, I think it's important to point out that prices would probably be a lot higher, believe it or not, because the oil that's been disrupted from Iran and from Libya has been replaced by a 2.5 million barrel a day increase in oil from the United States. So the question is, do we get to a point where we're producing so much oil in this country that we no longer have imports? And at that moment in time, if there was a disruption in the Middle East and we have 750 million barrels in the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, would we lend it to an ally? And how would that enhance America's power? Because we wouldn't need the Strategic Petroleum Reserve anymore to replace our own imports, because we wouldn't have any imports except maybe from Canada or Mexico. And so the question of what is the United States' posture globally on international oil prices? So perhaps if there's an accidental disruption of oil, that would be harder to make the decision. But certainly you can imagine a 1973-like situation where a country would go to a major consuming country like a Japan or even a China and say, we will cut off your oil unless you sell us arms or stop selling arms, or unless you in the case of Europe, unless you vote for a certain candidate and not for a certain candidate in an election. And in that setting, if the United States had its own energy supply, if our vehicles basically were either running on United States oil or were running on something else, and we could say, hey, geez, you're not subject to that blackmail because we, the United States, will lend you that oil from our Strategic Petroleum Reserve, you can imagine how 1973 could never happen again.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that point because the geopolitical frame and the decision in front of us is, do we want to be part of a world which is moving towards more security and more stability, in which we use energy as a major part of that solidarity with our allies, or do we fancy that we can just sit around in the North American continent and couldn't care less, not just about the Middle East, about which people have mixed feelings, but about our traditional European allies, the Japanese, and what does that do to the overall international position of the United States and to critical objectives, such as, for example, nuclear proliferation? If we decide we're not going to be a dependable ally, say, in the energy area, to Japan, and Japan is facing a North Korea that's developing a nuclear weapon, do you suppose that they're going to be less likely to think about their own options in the nuclear area? Similar kind of calculus on Iran, although I'm hopeful that with the new Iranian regime that there might be some traction. But, you know, the Middle East is not just oil. It's unfortunately the nuclear bomb. And not only that, it's a region that is connected integrally to the security space all around it. So that's why the Arab Spring is not just something of interest to North Africa. It's fundamentally interesting, you know, in a very large compass to the Islamic side of things. And it's just incredible to me that you can say, yeah, energy, we can be independent, but everything else, you know, we'll have free trade. Food, you know, our manufacturing, our exports, you know, all of that. But somehow energy is different, and we'll just sit here with our oil and gas and, you know, tell the world to take a jump off the cliff. That's not the way relationships work, and we have to get real, I think, about how to do this integrally as part of an international economic and security strategy.
Just imagine how serious this is to Japan. I mean, we worry about our energy and our oil independence. Japan has no oil, no gas. They're the third largest economy in the world, and they have just turned, and nuclear was a big part, and they've just turned all that off. So they are totally dependent on the rest of the world for oil and gas, for energy, and you know, which to a large part includes the Middle East. But we can be a part of the solution there. I think there's no question. Okay, so we talked about I think you talked about Europe and the impact of. I'd like to talk a little bit about Russia and Europe, and also there's a question here. It says, why are some of the Eastern European countries dragging their feet on fracking and oil and gas shale developments? Amy, do you want to take that one, or?
Well, I'd say that it varies. So Poland was very enthusiastic about fracking, and unfortunately for them, some of the first experiments in trying to produce oil and gas from shale in Poland were not technically successful. So there's a little bit of going back to the drawing board because the shale layers or the source rock in different countries have different properties, and it's not so easy to just, you know, we were very successful here in the United States, and it seems like it happened overnight, but it actually took a decade and a half. But there are other countries where people just feel strongly that fracking isn't safe. And you know, every community, Bulgaria has banned the practice of hydraulic fracking. It's banned in France. I think there's a lot of opposition to it in Germany, and it's, to my mind, at some level, really, it truly needs to be a question of science, right? So, you know, we have to move away from the emotionality, and we have to understand and inform ourselves about the science behind this, and where it's been used already, where it's been used safely, where it hasn't been used safely, what are the lessons we can draw from the places where there have been either accidents or bad practice, and what does that mean? And I think that part of that, I mean, David probably could speak to it better than I can in terms of bringing the science to Eastern Europe. But if I were an Eastern European, I would be very concerned about whether the institutional protections, because we have a long history of nuclear waste problems and other kinds of pollutant problems in Eastern Europe. And I'm sure that the people in different countries there have greater worries about whether the institution of regulation in their societies will be sufficient to ensure that it can be done safely.
No, I think you're right, Amy. In the past 18 months, I've run best practice workshops bringing geologists and hydrologists and petroleum engineers to Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Lithuania, Poland, and also Brussels. And I think there are a couple of things at play. The more dependent these countries are on a single source of gas, the more interested they are in developing shale gas. So Ukraine, Poland, extremely interested. But in all these countries, where especially ones like Bulgaria and Romania that experienced mining disasters, the regulators are really worried about whether they know enough to do it right. And so they really want to understand what regulations they need to have in place. So sometimes they look to the EU, and sometimes they look to the U.S., but they know they're different than the U.S. They don't have private landowners. So you've got to persuade people there's a local benefit, and you've got to persuade the government that they know what to do. And I think that's where governments can step in. But the other element not to be discounted is Gazprom.
Right.
So in Bulgaria, there's no question that Gazprom's influence is tremendous. They had organized NGOs, the likes of which Bulgaria had never seen, and this happened in about 4 or 5 weeks. So they're very well financed, and the Bulgarians are 100% dependent on Gazprom for their energy. So they're not about to buck that trend right away. But if you go farther into Western Europe, in France and Germany, Germany has renewables. They have a lot of gas. They have deep relationships with Russia. France has nuclear. It's not as important in those places, and so that's why I think it's more controversial. The UK is, I think, the interesting exception, where they need gas as part of their climate strategy, and they are wrestling right now with whether they can persuade the public they can do it safely.
You might think a little bit more about the Russian side of that question, which is typically Gazprom has had a tremendous amount of control over the European market, and that's what the Europeans have been pushing back against. But Gazprom now is facing enormous pressure. The market is not theirs in Europe for reasons of alternate sources of supply and the prospect of shale to the extent that emerges. And secondly, they have competition internally. It's very interesting to watch. Companies like Novatek are being given support from the top level of the Russian government. So there's a competitive environment, and then when the European Union comes in with pro-competition rules, which are really fundamental, and sticking to their guns precisely because they have greater degree of energy independence, forgive the expression, than they had in the past, Gazprom is on the retreat. And if you think about the world of gas, they say, all right, if we can't export that much gas to Europe, we'll export it to Asia. So they're talking about ramping up on export capacity in Asia. But guess what? There are a lot of people already there in Asia who have long-term contracts, and those countries in Asia know full well that a contract with Gazprom is something that you have to think twice or 3 times about. Ask the Chinese, who had negotiations with Gazprom over price for years and years, and they finally decided, no, we're not going to do this. We're going to get gas from Turkmenistan and other sources, and if the Russians ever get reasonable, then we'll talk to them. So there are major changes going on, and I would venture to say that demonopolization is a real prospect in Russia. I won't say tomorrow, but I'll say in 5 years, because of this combination of international and internal pressures. And the question is, where's the leadership, which is a private and public phenomenon, to continue to encourage Russia to move in that direction, because it actually is good for the Russian economy not to have a big fat monopoly controlling all of their gas supplies. So the whole thing makes sense, but in the meantime there are these awkward questions about who's making money out of the gas currently, and what are they trying to do to make sure that their rent continues and that they don't have the competition that they do not welcome, obviously.
So you're answering you're talking about Russia, but there's a question here that deals with sort of winners and losers in this thing. I mean, so there's actually, it deals with the losers, but let's expand it a little bit. because obviously people that are supplying, if you take natural gas, first of all, people supplying gas to the world are Qatar in the Middle East.
Correct.
Iran, potentially, in the Middle East. Russia, we've just talked about. And Venezuela, potentially. Seems to me in this, they're probably on the losing side of this equation. And the oil side of things, we can, some of the same culprits, but, there are losers. We've talked about the winners, which are our allies, which are the West, probably more than the tradition, what we call the West. So the question here says, what does it do to the economies of traditional oil producers? The Middle East, Russia, you've talked about Russia, but maybe the Middle Eastern countries. I mean, this change, this additional oil in the world, are we creating more instability, or do they have another home?
Well, Amy, you and Ed wrote this terrific chapter on what this means for OPEC, the stress it puts on OPEC. So
yeah, maybe I should have framed it as an OPEC question.
I think that my opinion is the Middle East countries have sort of dug themselves into a hole, and it's this same premise. They believed that we had run out of oil and gas, that it was scarce all over the world, and so therefore their monopoly was going to increase over time, and they could afford to have a higher and higher price over time, and they would have more and more money over time. And they planned everything on that basis. But the undercurrent is, and again, I'm always focused on the younger generation, maybe that's because I'm a university professor. In the Middle East, all that money that poured in after 1973, what did it produce? And I mean, there was a phase where people suddenly had better medical care and hospitals were built, and I'm not saying that it didn't produce anything, right? But you've had 4 decades of wealth, and income disparity is still extremely wide. And you have a lot of poverty throughout the region. You have people feeling that they have no economic future. All across the region, young people feeling that they're going to graduate from university, there's not a job for them, there's not a career for them, they don't have a future. They've missed the Asian tiger movement where young people in Asia have greater and greater opportunity, young people in America have greater and greater opportunity, and young people in the Middle East have no future. And this oil has produced nothing in terms of the benefits for the future's generations. And now they're facing this technology breakthrough in the United States and elsewhere, where there's going to be plentiful oil supply over time. And what is this going to mean? And I think that, for sure, if oil prices fall again, oil is a cyclical industry. It goes up for a while, and then we have more supply, and it goes down. If we get to the, quote, it goes down part of the story, which is somewhat geopolitical. I mean, if there's so much instability in the Middle East, that can hold the price up for a while. But if we start to get more and more supply and better efficiency in the way we use oil and gas, so we need less and less to do the same activities, then these societies are going to become even more desperate in terms of their future. And they have made no investments. The speakers, I've been at events where there have been speakers from Saudi Arabia, and they said, well, if you had to rely on one thing for the future of your country, what would be a better commodity than oil? And, that made sense to say that 5 years ago. That sounded really correct. But now that there might be, a surplus of oil coming at the same time that our automobiles are using less and less of it, it doesn't seem so promising if you're the grandson of that person who is giving that speech. So I do think we're in for a bumpy time, and as Americans, we care. And we don't just care because we needed the oil. We care because we care about democracy and human rights, we care, but we also care, quite frankly, as a matter of security. Because if you have a disenfranchised population in the Middle East and in North Africa, we all learned after September 11 that disenfranchisement can come to our own shores. And that's not a world that's going to be attractive. And so we do need to think carefully about what is the future for the Middle East that we would like to engage in, and how could we as the United States assist in that future, and have the vision and the opportunity for young people in the Middle East be equal to that of other places where there's economic promise, and how would that look, even in the face of falling demand for oil in the West? Obviously, everybody's banking on the fact that China's demand is going to grow so substantially, and all the Middle East oil is going to be able to go to China. But on some level, I don't think China really wants that future either, where they're highly dependent on the Middle East. I think the Chinese would like to have their own oil and gas, and like us, transition to clean tech. And nowhere today do people care more about air pollution. We care about air pollution desperately here in California, but not nearly, I think, as much today as young people in Beijing and Shanghai and some of these Chinese cities where it's just impossible to cope with the level. So I do think it's a challenge. And it is actually a challenge for the United States. It's not just a we won, post-1973. It took us 40 years, but we, like beating the Soviet Union, we finally beat OPEC. Because we have to worry about what happens after we beat OPEC.
Yeah.
I think there's also ripples in other parts of the world. I mean, you're seeing investment in Nigeria is pretty much flat. Nothing new happening. Brazil, not a lot of interest in their new bid rounds. Iraq, major companies leaving after that initial because they're coming to North America because it's safer, it's more stable, you're closer to market. So you've seen that huge shift there, and I think they're going to have to be competitive. Even Russia has lowered its taxes, doing joint ventures with Exxon and with Statoil in the Barents because you can't make money onshore. So it's really adapt or die, and I think it will be a good thing to force those economies to be more open and competitive. But the Venezuelas of the world may get left behind.
Out of business.
Just a quick postscript, which is two items. One is we think of consumers like us and producers like the Saudis. That's no longer the case. The Saudis are consuming more and more, and we're producing more and more. So that suggested that a strategy of engagement where we all talk about the energy universe from the same side of the table as opposed to being automatically win-lose is at hand. And who is more concerned about the employment opportunity in the kingdom than the Saudis? And that is why they have a $1.2 trillion program over the next 10 years to diversify into all kinds of areas, including a knowledge economy and science and technology. I mean, on the one hand, I applaud. On the other hand, I say, wouldn't it have been nice if it had started in the 70s as opposed to today? But we all share opportunities here so that if we sort of just rely comfortably on the old rhetoric about, those Arabs, we want to go elsewhere and so on, that's not the idea. The idea is to find the areas of common opportunity where now they are paying attention. And then the second point I'd make is what are the countries of greatest opportunity in terms of change in the energy system? I'd argue that in oil, certainly Mexico must be near the top, if not at the top. Mexico is talking about a major reform in which there will be opportunity for relations with foreign companies, opening up the system. If you add Mexico to Canada, the U.S., that's a blockbuster. And the second one is Australia. I'm just astonished. If you look at the presidential statements on the international energy system, they name all these countries and consistently forget about Australia. So I visited with someone in the White House and said, which country do you suppose is the most important in the area of gas that's newly arrived? Silence. I said, Australia, please put in the statement next time that Australia's and it's a country that shares our values, our principles, our approach to the international environment, would be a natural partner to talk about the ideas that we have in this book.
So you talk about partners and all this kind of stuff, and we always forget about Mexico. What about Canada? Now, there's two questions here dealing with the key. It won't surprise you. Keystone XL.
So
you've heard of that before. That's this.
So yeah.
Anyway,
rings a bell. Yeah.
So the question really is, if we're coordinated, if we're thinking about allies, if we're thinking about all this stuff, what the heck's going on with Keystone XL, David? And what's going to happen here?
Good. Put you on the spot.
yes. Well,
Well, you're the government, right?
yeah, it's interesting. I think from an energy security point of view, my own view is that it is 700,000 barrels a day of oil from a stable ally next door, providing the kind of crude that we don't produce, is probably the single most constructive thing we can do for U.S. energy security. But the politics are hard, and I think a lot of it dates back to the failure of Waxman-Markey, when the environmental movement really lost what was going to be, in their views, the major step to try and turn the U.S. to a low-carbon economy. And when that failed, Keystone became the touchstone of the environmental movement, and it's really driven by a desire not to have that oil produced. I think that's unrealistic because Canada is not going to sacrifice that part of its economy, and it has other options. But I think where we are in the end is in the end game right now. The State Department will produce the final environmental impact statement. They've had 3 studies, two commissioned by the State Department and one commissioned by the Department of Energy, not at the request of the State Department, all to look at the question of, if you didn't permit this pipeline, would the oil get produced in Canada, and would the U.S. Gulf Coast refineries refine heavy oil? And all 3 of these studies have said, yes, Canada will produce this oil, and yes, the Gulf Coast refineries will refine heavy oil. So the pipeline will have no significant impact on greenhouse gas emissions. But where we are right now, I think, is waiting on Canada to take one step more. And this is what the President said over the summer. He wants to be sure that there's a negligible impact. And if Canada releases its own oil and gas regulations, as it's been talking about for 2 years, and it starts to regulate emissions in the oil and gas sector in Canada, then that step, combined with other steps that the EPA and others have asked, will change Canada's GHG profile, enable it to meet the commitment it made to us and in Copenhagen to reduce its emissions by 17% from prior levels. And I think that will enable the line to be permanent.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so one more question. We haven't talked at all about Africa. What's in this for Africa? Amy, are you Africa-centric, or David? Are you? Sure. Do you want David to take that?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well,
are they going to be competitors in the future? Are they markets for us?
Well, for New West Africa, Liberia and Sierra Leone, they are looking at significant offshore production, and Mozambique, Tanzania, and possibly Kenya are, Mozambique and Tanzania in particular, have very significant reserves of natural gas. So they are likely to be suppliers of LNG to Asia. So I think for those countries, there's great opportunity. For Uganda, potentially a significant oil supplier. For Nigeria, Angola, I think they will have to deal with some of their issues of governance and transparency. So it's a moment of great opportunity, like many other moments of great opportunity for Africa. But whether that gets translated into development, whether it gets translated into electricity, really depends on improving the quality of governance in Africa. That's still an open question.
There's a great chapter by Charles McPherson, who has worked with the IMF and the World Bank for a long time, addressing this issue of transparency and governance and using case studies from Africa. Well worth reading.
Well, we're out of time. Who is it that says we managed to kill another perfectly good hour? But no, I think that was a great conversation, and I really want to thank Jan Kalicki, David Goldwyn, and Amy Jaffe for really a great discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks.